Welcome to the fourth episode of MFRR in Focus news webinar. First, we start with the headlines from Media Freedom Rapid Response in the last 2 months. During December 2021 and January 2022, MFRR has published 10 joint statements. In early December, a media freedom mission has been conducted in Greece, and the details of this mission will be published in the coming days, revealing the main challenges and issues affecting independent journalism and media freedom that we have observed through our meetings in this mission. In this period, we have also published a statement on Greece announcing our concern over criminal charges against investigative reporters. In Denmark, intelligence services warned media against publishing classified information, and in Germany, we have also published a statement concerning the rising attacks against journalists covering protests, and we have also made a call for digital platforms to take better measures to protect journalists against doxing. In Serbia, a wave of lawsuits against investigative portal Krik has chilled media freedom. And in Poland, President Duda rejected controversial foreign media ownership bill, which is also known as Lex TVN. In Montenegro, we made a call for end to impunity for shooting of journalist Olivera Lakic. And also, in Turkey, MFRR partner IPI has called for release of journalist Sedef Kabaş alongside 26 other media freedom and freedom of expression institutions. In Lithuania, State Data Protection Inspectorate, SDPI, has been called to not obstruct journalistic activity in the country. And in Albania, news outlets face cyber attacks following reports about the mayor of Tirana. And finally, we have initiated a press freedom mission in the Netherlands, and today we will be discussing this during the first part of our news webinar. I would also like to remind all of you to sign up for our monthly newsletter with an overview of core MFRR work and press freedom in the EU. There will be a link in the description below. And finally, as part of our headlines, I would like to mention that we have launched the Mapping Media Freedom Alert Explorer, the new version, and this also has been in use now. My first guest today will again be Antje Schlaf from European Centre for Press and Media Freedom to reveal the statistics from the Mapping Media Freedom from throughout the 2021. Hello, Antje, welcome.
Hello, Gökhan. Thank you. Welcome to the key statistics of the year 2021. On our platform, mappingmediafreedom.org, we already documented in total 6,200 press and media freedom violations since the start of 2014. And in the year 2021, we recorded 626 alerts in countries monitored by MFRR, which is European member states, candidate countries, and the UK. And we want to have a look at these today. So let's ask, which type of attacks happened here in 2021? More than 1 in 5 incidents included physical attacks. We recorded 49 cases where journalists got injured and 3 journalists have been killed. More than 40% included verbal attacks. This is intimidation, threatening, insult, abuse, harassment, and so on. Nearly 12% included attacks against property. This is equipment, private property, and also hacking, and so on. More than 1 in 4 incidents included legal incidents. So this is interrogation, arrest, but also lawsuits, and including several slap cases. And for censorship, it's about 11%. This includes censored articles, but also restricted access to events and press conferences and restricted access to information. So let's ask who performed the attacks. 41% were performed by private individuals who see the press and media more and more as their enemy. But there's also a considerable amount performed by police, legislation, or judiciary. And we also recorded several cases where the source is unknown. This mainly addresses online harassment and hacking. Let's have a look at where do these attacks happen. 28% happened during demonstrations and protests. several against corona measures. But we also have attacks which were performed online digital and in other places. Let's have a look at the topic COVID-19. More than 1 in 4 incidents was related to COVID-19. This is mainly related to protests against corona measures where journalists got attacked, but also other attacks or restrictions journalists faced, like laws restricting press and media freedom under the umbrella of COVID-19. So what are the main issues of 2021? It's definitely COVID-19, protests, and private individuals. And we have a huge overlap here. We recorded lots of attacks performed by private individuals during protests against corona measures. But the second issue is also online and digital attacks. We recorded a rise here. In 2020, we still had about 14% with online and digital attacks, and now this makes up nearly 17%. Feel free to have a closer look at Mapping Media Freedom and our new Alert Explorer. You can browse the cases via the map or also through our list. And there are also several filter possibilities you can combine to find what you search for. Feel free to report cases to us. Use our user-friendly reported form, and after you submit it, it will be verified by our partners and will be published. And furthermore, to have a closer look at the 2021 statistics, we will publish during February our monitoring report, which will give even a closer and detailed look to the statistics of 2021. That's all from my side. Back to Görkan.
Thank you so much, Antje, for sharing with us the statistics from the Mapping Media Freedom. Next in our program, we will have an interview with the MFRR representative of the month, Guusje Somer from Free Press Unlimited. And welcome, Guusje.
Thank you.
Today, I want to ask you regarding the ongoing free press mission in the Netherlands, executed by the MFRR, but also joined by some other international media freedom partners. Can you explain to us why is there being held a media freedom mission in the Netherlands these days?
Yeah, of course. What we see is that in the past years, the harassment and violence against journalists have increased in the Netherlands. So in 2021, for instance, 8 out of 10 journalists had dealt with harassment and violence, whereas in 2017, this was only 6 out of 10. So we see a clear increase. We see that violence and harassment against journalists does often, but really not exclusively, take place at demonstrations, for instance, COVID-related, but also at football matches. And as a result, the NOS, for instance, the Dutch public broadcaster, has decided to remove its logos from its fans in order to be able to send their reporters and journalists and photographers more safely to into the field. And last year, as I'm sure you know, Dutch investigative crime journalist Peter R. de Vries was killed. He was shot dead here in Amsterdam during daylight. And although it is debated whether he was killed for his role as a journalist, for his position as a journalist, or for his role in the Marengo trial, where he served as an advisor to the key witness, it is definitely perceived by many as an attack on press freedom. And this is particularly interesting in the case of the Netherlands, because the Netherlands are known to be a strong advocate for press freedom internationally. The Netherlands rank high on the World Press Freedom Index. And the Netherlands have a relatively strong protection mechanism in place called Persveilig. This is an initiative developed by the Dutch Association of Journalists, the Association of Editors-in-Chief, the National Police, and the Public Prosecution Office. And it is often, or the protocol aims at improving the safety of journalists, and includes action plans, but also legal safeguards, guidelines for the police, and a hotline, and many other things. And it's often praised as a good practice example that other states should follow. So that's why we think it's very interesting and definitely worth a mission to the Netherlands in order to investigate the declining safety of journalists. So that's why we're doing this international mission with the MFRR consortium.
Yes, you have given quite many shocking examples. When we come to think of the Netherlands, it is perceived as a country with rather high score in terms of media freedom indexes. But Antje has recently looked into the statistics from 2021, and also she had mentioned that there is a strong increase in terms of attacks against journalists in the past year compared to the year before. But what are the most common types of threats that the journalists in the Netherlands face?
Well, there are several. Persveilig has actually published a report, some sort of an annual report about the 2021 findings. In that report, it becomes clear that 2/3 of the violence against journalists was verbal. What we do see is that young journalists face more intimidation and threats than their older colleagues. So that's quite an interesting finding, I think, on average, of course. We also see that 17% of the violence was physical. This is something that photojournalists and camera reporters are most affected by, perhaps because they go to demonstrations and they go to report physically often. We had an example in Lunteren, a rural area in the Netherlands, where a car with a press photographer was actually pushed into the ditch by a tractor, with several bystanders being present as well. I think that's a good example of such physical violence. Also, another interesting example, I think, is that 1 out of 5 journalists in the Netherlands face legal harassment or slaps. And this generally affects mostly affects another group, which is investigative and political journalists and editors-in-chief and trial journalists. These are, I think, this gives an overview of the levels of harassment.
And across Europe, there is also another recurring theme, regardless of countries, and that is online harassment. In fact, today our theme is focusing on online harassment. What is the level of online harassment that the journalists in the Netherlands face compared to other threats?
Well, it's hard to say what the level is compared to other threats, but as you say, this is a wider problem, and we also see it in the Netherlands. And recently, or last year, actually, this also became quite an issue of debate in the Netherlands, and not only the online harassment against journalists, but also against politicians and academics increasingly. We also have had quite a public case of Clarice Gargaar, a Dutch journalist who had received over 7,000 threatening messages online while she was reporting on one of the Black Pete demonstrations, or anti-Black Pete demonstrations, I should say. And these threats were both often sexist and racist in nature. Eventually, 24 individuals were found guilty and had to either pay fines or do a community service. But it's definitely something that is a problem in the Netherlands as well. That's what I'm trying to make clear here. Currently, the government is working on or is preparing a law to criminalize doxing. So we are following that closely. And in our mission report, we also want to go into this, of course.
Thank you so much, Guusje, for informing us about the situation in the Netherlands, and we hope to cover the Netherlands Media Freedom Mission report in our next episode or the period after that. And thank you for joining us. Next in our program, we will be visiting one of the worst countries in terms of online attacks that the MFRR has been focusing on. This is going to be Serbia, and it is going to be a recorded interview with IPI's Jamie Wiseman, with a representative of NUNS in Serbia. Jamie, we are with you.
Well, thanks, Gökhan. One of the kind of comments you hear in newsrooms across Europe these days is that online harassment is just sort of part of the job of being a journalist in the digital age. And this kind of abuse is seen as something you just have to get to learn to live with and develop a kind of thick skin. But of course, many journalists are facing torrents of online abuse, ranging from trolling and insults to coordinated smears, and at the most serious level, death threats, which is posing new challenges for media organizations about how to keep their journalists safe, both online and offline. And nowhere is this more true than Serbia. And according from data from the Media Freedom Rapid Response, which, as we've heard, monitors attacks on free press in European states and candidate countries, Serbia in 2021 recorded the most number of cases of serious online threats against journalists. So to understand a bit more about this worrying trend and what's being done to address it, I'm joined now by Marija Babic, a researcher and legal advisor from NUNS, the Association of Independent Journalists in Serbia. Marija, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The Media Freedom Rapid Response, as I said, has assessed Serbia as having the highest number of these kinds of cases. We published a report earlier last year in May following a mission to the country as well, which really had that issue as a key chapter of concern. So from your kind of on-the-ground monitoring in the last few years, particularly 2021, give us a sense of how bad this problem is and what the effects on journalists are as well.
Yeah, NUNS has been monitoring and leading a database of the attacks and pressure on journalists for many years. And we noticed there's a trend that is the number of threats generally, but especially online. Threats and harassment of journalists are being increasing in the last few years. For example, last year, we recorded in our database 44 verbal threats to journalists in media, and 35 of them were online threats and harassment. And that shows us that the situation in Serbia is very bad, and that the internet, that social network opened a new space for harassment, threatening, and targeting journalists. The most suffered independent and professional journalists in media, and they are who are critically oriented. That for sure affect them and their job. But most of those journalists continue to do their job, and they struggle with that every day. On the other hand, you mentioned that there are journalists who point out that they are used to that. That is the part of their job, but I think that they're probably not even aware of how much that affects them. And also it is one of indicator of how bad the situation is in the Serbia. And it seems to us that the situation is even more difficult in the small local media, in the local society.
Okay, and of course, this problem isn't unique to Serbia, and online abuse of journalists is happening, journalists across Europe, both from trolls online and sometimes from politicians smearing journalists digitally as well. But what are some of the factors in Serbia you think that are kind of contributing to making the issue so bad there?
Yeah, the situation is similar in the Serbia. Very often a very big problem is that smear campaign, and very often they started by the politicians or high state officials, also by the tabloids and even some TV national station with the national coverage. And after that, they all transfer to the online sphere and continue with the online threats and harassment by ordinary people, ordinary citizens. And in my opinion, exactly that, those campaigns that come from the high state officials are particularly concerning in Serbia. They are ones who need to create a safe and normal atmosphere in the society for journalist work. But here is the quite opposite. They create such an atmosphere in which is normal to threat journalists, to insult the journalist, and they transmit their behavior on the citizen and on the whole society. And I think that maybe that is the most critical in Serbia, and that they need to stop doing that. And I think, as I said, that behavior become normal for the ordinary people and for the whole society.
Okay, I just want to zoom in on one key case that we saw in 2021, which involved CRIC, really well-regarded, well-respected investigative platform, which is a member of the OCCRP. And in recent months, its editor-in-chief and its staff have received numerous death threats of a really, really horrible nature, which look to be part of a kind of wider campaign of pressure. So it's often said that these kind of threats, they're done by online trolls, people anonymously, and they can't be taken too seriously. But in terms of CRIC, I just wanted to get your assessment on how serious and how threatening these kinds of online abuse can be and how dangerous they can be.
Yes, CRIC is often a target of pressure and intimidation for many years, not just pressure and intimidation, but these serious threats. And I can say that these recent threats are the part of the wider campaign of intimidation and pressure against CRIC. As I mentioned, also in the case of the CRIC, it often starts with that pressure and targeting by state officials, tabloids, and etc., and then continue with the online harassment and even serious threats, especially through social networks. We have a very big number of that kind of pressure on CRIC last year, and that's continue also in this year. That campaign that is constantly being run against CRIC is very dangerous. And I think, in my opinion, their safety in that situations is jeopardized, especially connecting them with the criminal plans that the tabloid started to do last year, and which, as we could see, continue this year as well.
Okay, and I mean, what kind of response have we seen from state authorities in Serbia to all of these different kinds of cases? We know there are different monitoring bodies there, but are these kinds of threats taken seriously by authorities? Do we see condemnations from police and from politicians? And are police actually following up on the cases?
But there are many mechanisms in Serbia about journalist safety. However, in our opinion, none of them is efficient enough. The most efficient mechanism is established through the Standing Working Group for Journalist Safety. And yes, we have quick reactions from the authorities in that first phase when the case happened. And some cases are resolved quickly, but that is not enough. We have a small number of cases with the court epilogue, and we are not satisfied with the penalties. Also, we still have a lot of unsolved cases and cases with unknown preparator. The government and politicians do not condemn threats. We have just some sporadic cases. Instead, as I said, they often start and run the campaign against journalists. And we saw that last year when we left the government working group for journalist safety, they didn't want to react to the Syria campaign against CRIC. And maybe it's most worrying that the journalists still don't trust the authorities when it comes to their safety. And I think that's a very big problem for Serbia.
Okay, well, thanks for so clearly outlining the challenges facing journalists in Serbia. The MFRR will continue to raise awareness about this issue and advocate and work with authorities there. So thank you for taking part, and thanks for the work of your organization.
Thank you very much to invite us to join you.
Thanks, and we'll hand back to you, Gökhan.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for this brilliant interview with a representative of NUNS in Serbia. Next in our program, we will be joined by Annette Rele's moderation from IPI. She will be moderating the panel discussion with her guests, Marcin de Kaminski of Civil Rights Defenders and justice journalist Samira Atillah from Belgium. And today's discussion topic will be online harassment targeting journalists.
Hello all. Today our topic of the day is online harassment and targeting of journalists on our panel of MFRR in Focus. Today on our panel we have two great guests, Marcin de Kaminski, who is the Director of Security and Innovation of the Civil Rights Defenders. And we also have Belgian journalist Samira Atillah, who is a journalist for the Belgian newspaper De Morgen, who focuses on justice but also investigates the far right. And she's also been a target of online harassment and threats. So welcome both. Very nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the first question for Marcin. As we know, online harassment constitutes the biggest part of attacks as reported on the Mapping Media Freedom platform. So I was wondering, could you tell us a bit about what are the developments concerning online harassment targeting journalists in recent years, in your opinion? So what have you seen? What has happened?
Thank you for the question. Civil Rights Defenders is an international human rights organization, and we work in 45 countries around the world, both in repressive environments, unstable democracies, and also in democracies. And what we see is a trend that spans over all of these contexts, where journalists are becoming targeted with hatred online to a larger extent than before. What we have seen over the last couple of years within the activities that my department is responsible for is first and foremost attacks to the extent to try to silence journalists, both when it comes to let's say, organized groups that are investigated for different reasons, when it comes to corruption, extremism, and maybe criminal activities, etc. But also when it comes from governments and officials trying to stifle independent journalism and calling the journalists to be overly biased, even if we know that independent journalism is not biased and that's neutral.
And what is the pandemic change for this? Have there been any recent, big change as you see it?
What we see is that many authorities have become more stressed during the pandemic when it comes to being investigated. So in many of the countries where we work, we have seen more oppression towards human rights defenders that also have spilled over to journalists. So journalists that have been investigating different kinds of right intrusions, which have been the effects of restrictive politics concerning trying to stifle the pandemic, have also then been targeted and questioned in order as part of the narrative to try to control the societies in times of pandemic.
Yeah, I see. So it's become very much widespread. Samira, what has been your experience in this regard? Can you please share with us what you have experienced?
Yes, since many years, I have been writing and speaking out against racism and xenophobia. Before I was a journalist, I wrote a lot of opinion pieces about those topics. And since I became a journalist 3 years ago, writing articles about sexism, racism, social issues, court cases, COVID vaccination, and the extreme right, for one of the biggest newspapers in Belgium, things have become progressively worse. I receive actually on daily basis different emails, Twitter, Facebook messengers filled with racist and sexist insults and threats, sometimes even death threats. I also have received anonymous phone calls threatening me. I get a little bit emotional because it's very disturbing me. My picture is and social media details are circulating in chat rooms and Facebook groups, generating even more hate. And lately, I'm receiving messages that are informing me that I will be forced to appear in a Nuremberg tribunal when the pandemic is over, because I wrote an article about anti-vax demonstrations and their organization behind it. According to the messenger, my crime is that I assisted the genocide by spreading fake news in the mainstream media. And so it goes on and on and on every day of my life as a journalist in Belgium.
That's awful. That's awful. How do you cope with this? How do you? Yeah, is there a way you deal with these threats?
It's very difficult for me at this point. My situation is very bad. I cannot do my job anymore as I should do. It has a very big impact on my daily life because I feel a lot of stress every time I publish something. I'm often afraid when I publish articles. I cannot go to demonstrations demonstrations in Brussels as a journalist anymore, because I'm afraid people will attack me. I just basically am hunted, and that's not a nice feeling, actually.
No, it sounds terrible, and it really affects your work and your daily life. So, Marcin, some of these accounts that threaten journalists like Samira are, anonymous and are sort of protecting themselves with anonymity. So, could you tell us a bit about the discussion on online harassment and anonymity? Is it enabling online harassment more, and could online harassment be prevented if no one was anonymous anymore on the internet?
No, I think the discussion about anonymity on the internet is really interesting and complicated, because the anonymity that also makes it possible for harassers to target journalists as Samira is also important for human rights defenders working under really difficult conditions. And this duality is important to highlight whenever we are discussing these issues, because we need to be able to enforce the anonymity of those that actually need it, and also to protect journalism from anonymous harassment. So we need to do both, I would say. But what really strikes me is that when you're talking, Samira, is that the story that you mentioned is also something that we see in other countries, including the country where I'm based in Sweden. And the narrative about putting journalists in some kind of trial because of their reporting during the pandemic, that is something that is common, and where you also have others that have been targeted with the same kind of harassment. So there are learnings to be made between different countries, I think, here, to make sure that you're not alone in this.
Okay, thank you. It's really disturbing to hear that other journalists receive the same messages, but on the other hand, I'm a little bit relieved that I'm not alone in this issue, I guess.
So, Samira, you decided to publicly share your story. You wrote a column about it, describing all the harassment that you faced. You also talked about it on public radio. So, what were your considerations when going public with this? And did you also have any concerns that it could, for example, trigger more harassment? Or, were you afraid when you came public with this story?
Yeah, I just could not take it anymore. I just had a breaking point, because this is going on for several years now. But as I told, the last year was very bad. And then I decided to come forward with my story on Twitter. I wrote the impact on my daily life. And I wrote in the tweet as well that I probably will get more hate by telling my story. But I also wrote that worse than worse is not possible for me. Of course, I was a little bit afraid, and typically, yes, it's true that I even received more hate from the anonymous accounts, more threats, etc. But there's also a lot of support, luckily.
When it comes to support, Marcin, could you tell us a bit about what kind of support civil rights offenders offer to journalists in case of online threats and attacks, like Samira, for example?
Well, what we can do, and also other organizations in our space could offer, is partially, of course, we can always discuss different security measures that could come into play when it comes to securing the activities of journalists. So we do a lot of office supports and also personal supports when it comes to maintaining the security of homes of journalists, because we also know that journalists are often operating as individuals, as freelancers, without maybe the possibility to have big offices that are properly secured. But then we also need to remember that when it comes to online hatred, there is a dimension where we also need to talk to platforms about the responsibility that they have to protect journalists and the free speech. So what we do is that we have a lot of ongoing dialogues with the major platforms to make sure that they both escalate cases when harassment is targeting journalists specifically, but also to make sure that they have good policies in place to just make sure that people are not hiding behind anonymity when spreading harassment and hate.
And do you get different requests from freelancers and from people working for news organizations? Do you see a clear difference between these two?
We usually see that news organizations are quite well equipped when it comes to handling these issues, but specifically freelancers are the ones targeted. And the problem here, I think, is that many larger news organizations are buying stories from freelancers that could potentially be instigating hatred, targeting the individual journalists. And then when the stories are published, the formal relation between the news organization and the journalist is over, meaning that news organizations are not fully taking the responsibility that they should, also after publication. So this is something that I believe is also responsibility of the larger news organizations to really look into how to take full responsibility for the journalists that they put into play.
Yeah, and also when these journalists are freelancers, they still have a responsibility to protect them.
Specifically that.
Yeah. And Samira, could you tell me a bit more about the support that you have received? So from journalism organizations, from your newspaper, from the readers, you said you received a lot of support. So yeah, how did that go? And what kind of support did you receive?
Yeah, I received, after I came out with my story, a lot of support from many people. First of all, from the readers of the journal I work for, but also from the front office of the journal and from the Flemish Professional Journalists Association. And also the European Federation of Journalists contacted me immediately and reached out and supported me super hard. Was very glad to hear from them. In Belgium, also the Minister of Media has called me to offer his support. And I also received a lot of nice messages from people on Twitter and Facebook. Different media houses wrote my story in their newspaper, and we are actually reaching out to each other and cooperating to work on safety protocols to protect their journalists as well as possible, including the paper I work for, because there was no policy. And some people and organizations in Belgium are also working on legal solutions to deal with hate messages. However, this is very difficult in Belgium because many of the insults and threats are protected by free speech legislation, and many of the accounts that generate the threats are anonymous, and it's very difficult to identify. But I got a lot of support, and I actually forgot how many people are actually very kind. And because of all the hate, I probably forget that there are so much good people on the internet as well. I asked also the European Federation of Journalists to send an alert for me, and they reached out and also contact me to listen to my whole story, and that was super nice. Thank you.
So you received a lot of support as well. So it also brought good things to come out publicly, besides all the other threats that you might receive. Thank you so much, both Samira and Marcin, for your time and your stories and your answers. It was really insightful. And yeah, I'm very happy that we could have you both here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne and Marcin, and also Samira, for sharing with us this very, very interesting and highly concerning details. And thank you to our viewers for watching us today. We have tried to focus on online harassment targeting journalists and also touched upon the media freedom missions that the MFRR has been holding in Greece and the Netherlands. And in the coming months, we will also be holding other media freedom missions in Italy and possibly France as well. For more details on the activities of the Media Freedom Rapid Response, please check MFRR.eu. And also, in order to use our new Alert Explorer and to submit cases regarding any kind of threats and attacks against journalists, please go to mappingmediafreedom.org. Thank you for watching us today.